We are very excited to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Bach. Elizabeth is the Ecosystem Restoration Specialist with the Nature Conservancy in Illinois, where she works with scientists, land managers, and volunteer stewards to investigate questions about tall grass prairie restoration ecology. So this is a little more scientific, as we were just talking about, than what we normally do, but I think you guys are ready. We've been doing a lot of like nature themed programs lately, and I think we're ready for something a little more in depth. So thank you for joining us tonight. Yeah, and if you have a question, go ahead and put that in the chat box at any time, and Elizabeth will get to those at the end of the program. And if you have a question for us or for me right away, you can always put that in the chat, and I'll kind of be on the back end of things answering those too. So, but otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you all this evening. And thanks to you all for giving up part of your evening to learn more about ecosystem restoration and more about carbon cycling and carbon storage. Before I dive in, I want to take a moment to be sure to thank some of the people who make my work possible, particularly my employer, the Nature Conservancy in Illinois. They are the ones who pay me and keep me going in this job and support the work that I and my colleagues do out at the Nachusa Grasslands Preserve, where I'm based. My colleagues Bill Kleiman and Cody Considine are out here with me, heading up the stewardship work we do to restore and protect prairie out in our neck of the woods. We're located west of the Chicago region. We're closer to Dixon, Illinois, so we're about 100 miles west of the Chicago region. This evening's presentation, you're going to see a lot of beautiful photos taken by Dee Hudson and Charles Larry, so I want to be sure to acknowledge them and their excellent photography skills. You'll be very thankful you didn't have to settle for my photography skills as we go along. So I usually begin this presentation with a question about who finds carbon sequestration as a topic intimidating. And because we're virtual, I can't see you all raise your hands, but I'll be honest, I find it intimidating, and I'm the one who's supposed to be giving the talk about it. So I'm going to ask you all to start by taking a deep breath with me so we can begin to focus on this somewhat intimidating and somewhat complex topic. Okay, well, at least I'm feeling calmer. And actually, the atmosphere, the air we all just breathed in, is a great starting place for a story about carbon cycling and storage. So what did we all take a breath of? Well, you might be thinking oxygen, and in part, you'd be right. Oxygen is what our bodies are using from that big breath of air we all took. But there's other things that come along in the air with that oxygen. More than 99.9% of Earth's atmosphere is made up of only 3 gases. And again, if we're in person, I do this a little more Q&A virtually to keep things rolling. I'm going to kind of give you the answer right off the bat. There's 3 key gases. They include nitrogen, oxygen, which is what we need, and argon, which is kind of an unusual candidate. What some of you may be noticing is that carbon dioxide is actually not on this list. And if we really break it down, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide is about 400 parts per million. That's 0.04% of the total atmosphere. So what's the big deal with carbon dioxide? Why are we so worried about it? Well, some of you may have taken a chemistry class some point in your past, and you may have thought, when am I ever going to use this in real life? Well, today is that day. What's different about carbon dioxide from the 3 gases that make up 99.9% of the atmosphere is actually how it's chemically bound together. In these key gases, nitrogen is a nitrogen-nitrogen triple bond. So the way to think about this is if you had your 2 hands together and you had 3 rubber bands, it'd be really hard to pull those apart, right? There wouldn't be a lot of space to move. That's essentially how this triple bond is working. Sunlight bombards it and with energy, and those bonds really can't do much. They're very, very stable. Oxygen in our atmosphere exists as dinitrogen, and it's a double bond. So again, think about 2 rubber bands, a little easier to move than the 3 rubber bands, but still really hard. It's just doesn't have a lot of space to absorb and use that energy. And the third gas, argon, is what's called an inert gas or noble gas. It actually has a complete electron shell. And when sunlight hits it, those electrons, they're already satisfied. They can't absorb any more energy. So they just are. They stay as they are. What's different about carbon dioxide is that it has two additional bonds. It has a carbon in the middle and two oxygens on either side. So here, I'll use my head. And if we think about each of those as a spring, we can see this molecule actually moves a bit back and forth, as that animation just showed. And that makes it fundamentally different from those other gases that dominate our atmosphere. And sunlight is what activates these little electrons in these atoms to move around within that molecule. And it's absorbing sunlight and then emitting heat from that absorbed sunlight that creates this greenhouse gas effect that leads to warming and changing climates. So I digress a little bit. You probably didn't show up this evening for a hard-hitting chemistry lesson. You were promised ecology. So let's turn back to ecology. We'll take another big breath together and refocus. Breathing is the essence of carbon storage and cycling. All living things do it in one form or another. As humans, we breathe in oxygen, it reacts with our food, and this is a combustion reaction. It produces the building blocks for our muscles, organs, and bones, and it also produces body heat we need to regulate how our body functions. The byproduct of this combustion reaction is carbon dioxide, which we exhale. So we've just converted a little bit of our dinners or our afternoon snacks into heat, body mass, and CO2. This is the opposite of what we're thinking about when we talk about carbon sequestration or carbon storage. In that process, we need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, turn it into something solid or permanent that can stick here on Earth and not go back to the atmosphere. Now, if there's only a way we could engineer how to do that, right? Oh, wait, plants. Plants do exactly this. Plants take up CO2 from the atmosphere and they respire oxygen. They directly convert that CO2 into leaves, stems, roots, and other plant parts. Bonus points, they're 100% solar powered. They've evolved to maximize carbon dioxide capture in almost every ecosystem on Earth. So I could just end the talk here, right? Take home message, to address climate change, we just need more plants. Problem solved. And honestly, if you only remember one thing from this talk, it should be this. However, as always, the story's a little more complex than just that. What kinds of plants? Well, there's over 100,000 species of plants on Earth. Every year, scientists describe about 2,000 new plant species. There's plants functioning and absorbing CO2 in places and ways we don't even know about. 21% of plant species are threatened with extinction. It's important to protect what we have. They could do really important things for us. On the other hand, about 5,000 plant species are considered invasive. These are plants that move into a habitat and take it over and often exclude native biodiversity that really needs that habitat to thrive. So if I can amend my take-home message slightly, I would say we need more plants in the right place. We want to leverage plants that have already evolved to function in an ecosystem to continue thriving in that ecosystem and doing what they do best, which is growing. However, some of you may be realizing that this talk was advertised as a talk about soil. And here I've been prattling along for, I guess, 6.5 minutes now and haven't even mentioned soil. So let's take another deep breath and start to open the box on that topic. Did you know that soil breathes too? Snoopy, ever a beacon of wisdom, brings us straight to the heart of the matter in this comic. We see Snoopy watching a leaf falling off of a tree, probably in autumn when they fall off the trees in this part of the world. And in the last pane, Snoopy's thinking to the leaf, "You don't know it, but your troubles are just beginning." Snoopy's right. This leaf's troubles are just beginning. And what exactly happens to a dead plant? Well, you might be thinking it decomposes, and you'd be right. For soil critters, including worms, springtails, fungi, and bacteria, those dead leaves are lunch. They're going to do exactly what we do with our food, nibble up that delicious veggies and fruits and use that for growth and energy. And although many of these organisms don't have a respiratory system the way we do, they're still breaking down their food in the same process. It's still a combustion reaction that uses oxygen and releases CO2. And we can't really measure this for an individual organism, especially these microscopic bacteria and fungi. So when scientists like me are trying to understand how soil is breathing and cycling carbon, we will often measure it for soil as a whole. We'll put a little ring down in the dirt and measure the CO2 and the gases coming out. And that helps us understand the overall respiration happening in the soil. And that's basically decomposition. It happens all the time. And typically, the amount of carbon dioxide released from soil during decomposition is similar to the amount of carbon dioxide these plants take up during the growing season, where they produce these leaves and stems that die off in the fall. And this produces a bit of an annual cycle. So on Earth, the majority of our land mass is actually distributed in the northern hemisphere. So when we look at this visualization from NASA, which is looking at kind of a hypothetical atmosphere in July, end of July, we see this colors looking at the concentration of carbon dioxide. The bright red colors are higher concentrations of carbon dioxide. The cooler green and blue colors are lower concentrations. And we can see a few red hot spots, but we can see a lot of space and a lot of cool colors. If we fast forward to December, we see this big spike in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And some of this is simply because of decomposition. And some of this is because the fossil fuels that humans are burning, that CO2 is not being taken up by plants because the majority of plants are growing in the northern hemisphere and they're not photosynthesizing at this time of the year. So if we put this together in an animation, we can actually watch the Earth breathe in real time. Starting out in January, when we're kind of at the heart of dormancy in the northern hemisphere in winter, we can see these warm colors, these CO2 concentrations beginning to accumulate in the atmosphere. And that's, as I said, the result of fossil fuel combustion, as well as in some part natural decomposition. And as we watch the seasons progress, here we're looking at March and we'll move into April, we'll start to see things shift as the growing season begins to take off in the northern hemisphere. So as we begin moving into May, you may be starting to see little blocks of cool colors, that's lower CO2 concentrations pulsing this mixing of red and orange. And that's where we're starting to see photosynthesis really kick into action again in the northern hemisphere. And if you're watching the southern hemisphere, you'll see the opposite of this pattern. As the growing season takes off here in June and into July, we see those CO2 concentrations come way down. Now, we still see pulses of CO2 coming from cities. This is from human use, human fossil fuel combustion. And we'll see it also kind of shift towards the southern hemisphere, which is now in their winter time where there isn't photosynthesis happening. And the take-home point here isn't that, that plants can take up the CO2 that's being emitted through fossil fuels. What this is to show is that our Earth is kind of naturally balanced with decomposition and CO2 uptake. And when we as humans burn more fossil fuels, we actually keep pushing a little bit more CO2 into the atmosphere that can't be taken up by photosynthesis each year. And I keep in mind these visualizations are 15 years old. It'd actually look a little different if we had data from 2021. So carbon exists on Earth in a couple of different pools, and the atmosphere is actually one of the smaller of those pools. And if we remember back to the start of the talk, it's because our atmosphere is dominated by these relatively inert gases of nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. Yet it's still an important source and pool, what we call pool of carbon, mainly in the form of carbon dioxide. The largest pool of carbon on Earth are rocks. This is stuff like limestone, coal, oil, those sorts of sources. And that's where the majority of carbon is locked up. And most of those rocks take thousands, if not millions of years to form. And they're very stable. They don't weather apart very quickly. The way to fast track moving carbon out of that soil pool is when we burn it, when we burn fossil fuels. And that moves it directly from the rock pool to the atmosphere pool. We also see a lot of carbon in the oceans. The oceans are the second largest pool of carbon. Oceans have a tremendous capacity to absorb CO2. However, when they absorb CO2, it dissolves in ocean water and becomes carbonic acid. And there it contributes to ocean acidification, which is a major downside to marine organisms like corals and shellfish. So there's some real limitations to carbon storage in oceans. The third largest pool is soil. And that's the one I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk. Soil is unique because it's a pretty large size pool of carbon. It is a pool that we can, in relatively short times, potentially add carbon to or take carbon away from. And we can do it in a way that doesn't have a lot of downsides. It doesn't have a lot of other risks the way ocean storage of carbon does. So what we really need to think about for getting carbon in soil is that decomposition process. There's several factors that limit decomposition. So in the decomposition process, your plant synthesized carbon is being pushed into a soil pool. And if it decomposes all the way, soil organisms just respire it back as CO2 and it's a net balance. But there's ways that we can actually slow down that decomposition and actually capture some of that plant material and keep it below ground, at least for a pretty long time. And those factors include things like temperature. Warmer temperatures usually yield faster decomposition. Oxygen availability, more accessible oxygen, more decomposition. Access to plant litter, the ability for these organisms to even find that plant litter and consume it for lunch or dinner or breakfast. The chemical complexity of the plant parts also matters. Things like fire, wildfires, or prescribed fires matter. And human activity, like tilling soil or building buildings, also makes a really big difference. So to get to the root of the issue, soil provides a combination of many of these factors that can limit decomposition naturally. Soil temperature is a much more narrower range, and it tends to be cooler during the hot summer, limiting the rate of decomposition. Oxygen can't mix as easily through a solid soil matrix the way it can in the air, and so it limits oxygen availability and limits the ability for that plant material to decompose. Access to plant material is another key thing. That soil matrix, those critters have to burrow through there and find that soil material. So they're spending a fair amount of energy finding the food they need to consume as well. And it just keeps slowing down that decomposition process. And roots are really the primary source of carbon below ground. Leaves and stems, some of that makes it below ground through burrowing mammals and that sort of thing. But the majority of the carbon that comes into soil comes in through the roots that grow directly into it. And of course, that chemical complexity can make a difference. So your tough woody root from a tree doesn't decompose as rapidly as a nice, juicy, fibrous root from, I don't know, a garden plant. So to build on this take-home message just a little bit more, to think about carbon storage and addressing climate change, we need to think about more plants in the right place with less decomposition. And that's how we start making a difference. Well, there's still a few more caveats to talk through. So let's all take another breath before we get too excited to save the world. Soils have a carbon saturation point. Like a glass of water, you can add water up to the brim, but once it's full, it just overflows. You can't add any more water to a full glass. Soils have a carbon saturation point. We can fill a soil up with carbon to a certain point, but once we hit that point, decomposition and respiration essentially match, and we can't add more carbon to that system. It's a steady state. And so when we think about what we can proactively do to think about soil carbon and how to leverage that to mitigate climate change, there's two key things to keep in mind. If we're looking at a system where that glass is full, we want to keep it full. If we're looking at a system where that glass is not full, that's an opportunity to refill that glass to the top. So I'm going to bring together some data from some work here in Northern Illinois to show you and exemplify what I'm talking about here. These are three graphs that come from three different scientific papers. The one on the far left was done at the Fermilab restorations. This is in Batavia, Illinois. Some of you may be familiar with it, others may not be. There's a series of prairie restorations that were done above that physics lab out there. And what we see in this graph is soil carbon on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. And that time element is basically, they measured a bunch of restorations that had been restored for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and then compared it to remnant prairies that have never been plowed. And that's what you see. I'm going to use my pointer here. These are the remnant prairies. These are the restorations. And you can see this modeled increase in soil carbon over time. The middle graph comes from prairie restorations in Nebraska, where things are much drier. And the far right panel actually comes from some work done by a colleague here at Nichusa Grasslands, where we have a much sandier soil than in these other two studies. And this exemplifies some of the factors that affect that carbon saturation point, the amount of clay in your soil and the climate conditions where that soil is. And there's two key things I want to show you on this graph. The first is that these different soils hold different amounts of carbon. So you may have noted that that y-axis here is not the same scale in these studies. So I've put a gold star to match the same value on each of these y-axes. And what you can see is because that gold star is at a much lower point on that y-axis means that these soils have a much higher quantity of carbon in them than when we look at the dry Nebraska soils or the sandy Nichusa soils. And there's nothing right or wrong or better or worse about any of these soils. It's just, these are what these soils are. It's who they are, and it's the property of those soils. And what we see here is that the kind of clay, deep, dark soils from Fermilab have about 3 times the potential carbon of the Nebraska and the Nichusa soils. And so this is essentially analogous to your 8-ounce coffee cup versus your 32-ounce big gulp. And if we look at the amount of time it takes to accrue that carbon to fill those cups back up, so to speak, we see that that rate varies a little bit, and that the amount of time it would take to refill those cups varies, again, about 3-fold between these Illinois prairies, which, while they're capable of holding a lot more carbon, it takes them much longer to refill that glass. It takes longer to refill a bigger glass than in these other soils, where maybe it's a smaller glass, but we can refill it much more quickly. So this brings me to the 3 steps to what we might call soil carbon management. Accrual. This is how soil carbon gets into the soil. This is that decomposition process where plant material winds up in soil, which I've spent a lot of time talking through. The second step is storage. How do we keep that carbon in the soil? And that has to do with some of the factors that we've also discussed, things like temperature and climate, the soil texture, the amount of clay or sand that's in your soil. Those all affect how much carbon can fit in that soil. And then that last stage, which we often hear talk about, is called sequestration. And in a general sense, sequestration just means locking up carbon in the soil. But in the scientific sense, this is a very specific term. And it means that that carbon is going to be locked up for centuries, potentially indefinitely. And that's really hard to demonstrate with data, that once that soil carbon winds up in the soil, that it's going to stay there for a really, really long time. And that's very much where scientists are working actively to try and better understand, so that we can understand what the real potential for soil carbon is to mitigate climate change. So for the last portion of this talk, I'm going to shift us into some action items, some things that might make us feel like we can go home and do something about global climate change, or even the biodiversity in our own backyards. And my key message here is protect what we have and restore where practical. So as we think about protecting what we have, I have to share this wonderful Far Side comic, which once again hits the nail right on the head. We see here the older man talking to the younger man, and you see this ring right here, Jimmy? That's another time when this old fellow miraculously survived some big forest fire. So this is exemplifying the case of a tree that survived a lot in its life, and it's built into a very large tree from carbon that's pulled from the atmosphere. And a couple of humans have come along and cut it down to marvel at it. In the state of Illinois, we've seen a dramatic transformation of our natural landscape over the past 170 years or so. In the 1850s, this landscape was dominated by prairies and forests and wetlands. And today it's really dominated by row crop agriculture. And while that transformation has certainly brought about a fair amount of agronomic prosperity, it's also brought some environmental consequences. And one of those is the loss of about 30 to 50% of soil carbon, most of that happening in the first few years after tillage. So what happens with tillage is you till up the soil, you're actually increasing oxygen availability by mixing air in with it. It increases decomposition. It releases carbon dioxide, or releases carbon from that soil system as carbon dioxide, where it's actually actively contributing to global climate change. We have so few natural areas left in Illinois that there's really a strong priority to protect what we do have left. This is the example of keeping that full glass full. And I want to share some work from some colleagues of mine at the Nature Conservancy, looking at the potential for kind of natural areas to mitigate climate change. And this is a global analysis. So I want to offer a really big caveat. These numbers and these relationships don't necessarily dial down to the local Illinois level in exactly the same way you see them here. But what I want to bring up in this figure is to show you where some of these strong potential to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere exists. And we see things like reforestation, which makes sense in an ecosystem that's dominated by trees or historically was. In Illinois, where we were historically dominated by grasslands, reforestation may not make sense, at least in the north and central part of the states. Southern Illinois is kind of a different story. What I really want to draw your attention to is this bar here, which is avoided grassland conversion. And again, this is a global number, so it doesn't necessarily scale to Illinois in exactly the same way, but this is the global equivalent of keeping those full glasses of grassland soil carbon full and protecting them from development, where it would release more carbon into the atmosphere, actually be a source of carbon dioxide. However, in a state like Illinois, we don't have a lot of those full glasses to keep full. So we can start to look at a second opportunity, and that's restore where practical. And this certainly isn't practical in all situations or in all places, but in places where it does make sense, grassland restoration, tallgrass prairie restoration can play a really important role in mitigating climate change by pulling CO2 down into the soil. And if we look at this box on the graph, we can see that quite a bit further down. Now, as somebody who works in grassland restoration, the first time I saw this bar, I was a little bit disappointed. I was positive that what I did was going to make a bigger difference. But this brings some really important points for us to wrestle with. And as a scientist, we always have to challenge ourselves. Again, this is a global analysis, and the potential for grassland restoration globally isn't as big of a box as protecting existing grasslands. Whereas in Illinois, it's actually a much bigger box than protecting what's left because there's so little left. The other thing I really want to bring our attention to are these other benefits that come along with these bars. Climate mitigation and carbon dioxide storage are very, very important, but they're also not the only thing worth focusing on as we think about global challenges. Things like biodiversity loss, water quality, and even air quality are hugely important as well. And restoring grassland habitats provides a tremendous benefit to additionally support these other aspects of the ecosystem. So as we think about ecological decision making, we can think about carbon storage and addressing global climate change, and that's a great starting point. But it's also equally important to give biodiversity and these other environmental benefits equal weight, and understanding how solutions like restoration can actually integrate multiple outcomes for a better world. So for all the overachievers out there, there's actually 5 things I want you to take home from this talk. More plants in the right place with less decomposition by protecting what we have and restoring where practical. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to answering questions and continuing this discussion with you all.
So I don't see any questions right now, but I have a question. So how does a vegetable garden relate to this? Is that good? You know, is it better for you to grow your own veggies or?
That's a great question. I certainly I have a big garden myself. Yeah, and that kind of gets into a whole nother angle that I did not talk about in this, which is where we source our food, because we all need food and we need healthy foods. And the way we grow those foods is a really important part of thinking about climate mitigation and how our world works. And so in places like Illinois, where we have generally very fertile soils, we generally have a lot of moisture, a lot of rain, we have a really good growing season, we can grow a lot of food in this area directly. And that can include your backyard vegetable garden, and that can include farmer fields as well. So yeah, it's a great tool, especially when you think about the contrast of purchasing a lot of vegetables that are grown in places like California, where water is very limiting, or that have to travel very far from other parts of the world to reach us. Being able to consume some of your food from a backyard vegetable garden is a great way to make a difference in your own actions. Yeah.
Great. Good. Then we're doing some good. Okay. Can you speak at all to carbon capture in storage in the ground?
Sure. And I might ask a little bit clarifying. Is this questioner asking about kind of the engineering approaches to carbon capture, or kind of the more natural carbon capture that I talked about a little bit more?
Okay, we'll give Sam a second to put that.
Okay, I can address either. I just want to make sure I'm addressing the right question.
We'll move on then. Oh, engineering, he says.
Engineering. Okay, great. Yeah. So that's what I kind of suspected that's where this was going. So in that sense, I'm not an engineer and I'm not super well versed in those, but some of the big differences with the engineering approaches to carbon capture are they can require a lot of energy to actually do that carbon capture, and that energy comes from somewhere. And so there's kind of this, again, this trade-off between energy and exhaust produced while actually directly capturing that carbon. And I think in some situations that engineering approach can make a difference. This is certainly, climate change is a problem that we kind of need all solutions on deck for. The trick is it's not necessarily been proven well to scale up at a large scale. So there's a few pilot engineering carbon capture opportunities out there, but they really haven't been able to scale up and take off. Whereas some of the more natural carbon solutions, while they may be slower in the long run, we can get them started right now today. So it's not to say that the engineering solutions don't offer anything, but they tend to offer more risks and less certainty than some of the other approaches to just leveraging nature to take up CO2, which it's been doing for millions of years.
Okay. And can you talk about animals and their relationship with the soil?
Sure. Oh, this is one of my favorite topics.
Mhm.
Yeah, my background is a soil ecologist, and I've spent a fair amount of my career working with soil ecology. So yeah, over 25% of all biodiversity on Earth actually lives in the soil. And yet we tend to just completely ignore it. So this ranges from single-celled bacteria, microscopic fungi, microscopic animals like nematodes, roundworms, springtails, larvae, all of these things, on up to the kind of creepy crawlers we think about, the centipedes and millipedes, the spiders, as well as small mammals like mice and snakes and voles that actually create little burrows in the soil and live part of their life down there. And those animals are all really important, and the interactions among them is really important. And that's really the heart of how this dead plant material winds up in the soil. It's the actions of all of these animals interacting with each other. So the big animals tearing things apart, digging holes, stuffing things into little burrows, and then those little microscopic critters coming in and shredding them down even further and consuming them for lunch. So a healthy soil ecosystem is really the key to a healthy above ground ecosystem and a healthy earth all around.
Nice. And let's see, can you speak about the differences between factory farms and regenerative practices?
Sure, yeah. So there can be a bit of variation kind of in both of those categories. But typically when we're thinking about, and I'll say industrial farming, typically in a factory farm, we're thinking just like the livestock sector. If we're thinking industrial and we spread that definition to livestock and kind of grain production, we have a really efficient system. This is a system that's been built based on maximizing yield per acre, maximizing outcomes, sometimes calories per acre. It's actually an incredibly efficient system, but it relies really heavily on a lot of inputs. A lot of those inputs like fertilizer and pesticides take a lot of energy to produce. Um, and so there can be downfalls. We lose a lot of what we might call ecosystem services. And so the regenerative farming angle is looking to try and bring more of those services back into the equation. So similar to how I talked about ecosystems and their capacity to mitigate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but there were these other co-benefits like biodiversity, air quality, water quality. Regenerative farming is thinking about some of those other categories as well as food production. And so it's a little more holistic of an approach. And there's advantages and disadvantages of both of these systems, and learning from each other is really helpful, I think. And like I said, there's a great variation. So some regenerative farming practices are really integrating a lot of components of food production, and some are just integrating a few. And I think agriculture is one of those sectors where we all have to start just taking steps in the right direction. And producers are starting from all across the spectrum and encouraging movement forward all the way from adaptation of cover crops to shifting to a more integrated regenerative ag system is an important path for all of us to be thinking about.
Nice. So the Ford family wanted to ask, not that I want all non-natives, but do non-natives capture carbon equally as well, or do natives capture better since they are in the right place?
I love this question. So this is one of those really interesting things when you put your lens on and you only think about a carbon equation. There are some cases where an invasive will take up a lot of carbon because maybe it's a woody thing that grows really densely like buckthorn or honeysuckle. But on the downside, it chokes out all of the other native habitat. It's really detrimental to wildlife, and it really undermines what's actually a globally rare ecosystem. Here in Illinois, our prairies and savannas are some of the most endangered ecosystems worldwide because we've converted so much of our land use. So I like to say putting the right plants in the right place is really the way to go. You're going to get that carbon benefit. You're going to get that carbon absorption. And in fact, especially in a grassland situation, more of that's going to wind up below ground in the soil and less of it's going to wind up in brush above ground where it can burn up in a fire or just get when it dies, it'll just decompose, or somebody coming in to just clear it out. So having that natural ecosystem that's kind of storing carbon where the system has evolved to store it is really the way to go. I think that there's just enough downsides to try and gaining a carbon system without thinking about these other components that we'll live to regret it if that's the only thing we focus on.
Mhm. Okay. And Sean has a great question. Where can we find out more about your work?
Oh, great question. So I do have a website, and I'm realizing I should have put this up on a slide. Maybe I'll put it up in the chat. Soil Organic Matters. Make sure I spelled it right. So that's my website. It's not extensive, but it'll give you a sense of some of the papers I've published, some of the work I've done. That's a great place to find out more about my work. You can also look at where I work, the Nachusa grasslands. That's a really fantastic restoration project. I didn't spend much time talking about it here, but that's another place that you can learn more about the work I and my colleagues do. We're open to the public for hiking. We have a great visitor center, bring your kids. There's a herd of about 100 bison at the preserve that sometimes are viewable from the visitor center. Sometimes they're hiding out in other parts of the prairie where you can't see them. But yeah, come on out for a visit or check us out online to learn more about that restoration project.
Well, thanks. So I don't see any more questions. I think that was like a perfect last question there. And yeah, just thank you so much for making what seems like kind of a complicated and, complex topic so approachable. I think we all kind of know where we can go a little bit from here. So
Awesome. Well, thank you for the invite. Thank you all for coming and for your attention. Yeah.
thank you so much. So everyone listening, thank you for attending tonight on this kind of stormy evening. So we have coming up, you may be interested on July 7th at noon. We have When Galaxies Collide and What Happens Next. That should be a fascinating discussion. That's led by a professor from Harper College. So please join us for that. And otherwise, have a great night.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.